How do you go from Downton Abbey to contemporary thrillers? Catherine Steadman joins us to talk about her newest novel, The Disappearing Act. In what sense was Nixon's downfall America's tragedy? Michael Dobbs will be here to talk about his book, King Richard. Alexander Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, our critics will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's July 2nd. I'm Pamela Paul. Catherine Steadman joins us now from London. Her new novel is called The Disappearing Act. Catherine, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So we should say up front that many people will know your name as an author. This is your third book, but also as a successful working actress. What made you decide to write?
Acting has a lot of downtime. Even when you have a job, you're in trailers or you're in cars going to set. I don't know, through a process of osmosis, reading so many scripts all the time, I sort of go into it in the book a bit of just the sheer quantity of things that get sent to you before you can actually get a part in something. The quantity of stories I'd read, I just thought, oh, I'll give it a go. And I'd always wanted to write a book. And people often say, I'm writing a book. And then it gets to a point where you sort of don't want to ask them anymore. So I thought, I won't tell anyone I'm doing it because I don't think I could stand the pressure of people constantly asking me how it was going. So I just thought, I'll write it. I won't tell anyone I'm writing it. I'll see how far it goes if I finish. And yeah, it's sort of been a process since then.
You'll pretend to be knitting like all the other actors.
yeah, exactly. Or I do a lot of writing on my phone when I'm working or in my trailer. So it can often look like I'm playing Angry Birds or something, but I'm actually using my notes app.
Are there other ways besides giving you copious downtime in your trailer that being an actor has informed your work as a writer in terms of pacing or characterization or anything else?
Oh my God, yes. You get a real feel for what works in a scene and what doesn't. You'll be there on the day on set and they'll go, this scene isn't quite working. And, if you get a good director, they'll often just say to the actors, why don't you see where it goes? Or we'll keep the scene running a bit longer and see where it goes. I think that natural impulse towards improvising is really helpful. And I always say to other actors, like, if you're thinking about writing a book, you should, because that muscle is translatable into writing as much as it is into acting.
And has that writing work then in turn informed your acting?
Yeah, it has actually. It's given me a lot more perspective. When you're an actor, you can often be very insular about your character and the scene and what your journey is. But I think as a writer, it opens up the whole world of the production. So you're seeing yourself more as a cog. That's the dream for any actor, to be like the perfect ensemble actor. But when you're writing, you do really understand how your character is a cog in the machine of the story.
One of the interesting differences between a script, obviously, and a novel is that in a script, you are relying on the fact that what you see on screen is going to fill in so many of the blanks that in a book, presumably you have to fill those in yourself. And I'm curious, did that come naturally to you? Did you find yourself realizing oh no, I have to stop and set the scene a little bit more so that people have it all on the page?
Yeah. Totally. With scripts, you have chunks of dialogue, and then in between you get sort of scene descriptions or action descriptions. And it's so easily translatable into novel writing. I mean, you get a lot more scope for when you're writing a novel. You can really set the scene. Often in scripts, they want you to cut down and compress the action and use an economy of words. But with writing a novel, you can really take your time and set out the scene for the reader and hopefully immerse them in the visuals of that.
I want to go back and talk about your first two novels in a moment because they have nothing to do with Hollywood. But your new book, The Disappearing Act, takes place very much in this world. And I have to ask, did you have these thoughts saved up and you just had to spill them and put them into a book? Because there is quite a bit of what it's like being a young female actor in Hollywood.
I hadn't thought actually to write a book set in the acting world until my publisher said, why not have a go at that? And then suddenly the idea of setting something during pilot season just seemed to me like such an interesting concept, because I don't think many people sort of know about it. It's actors from all over the world. They descend on Hollywood once a year and they all sort of fight it out for all of the lead roles in the new series. It's a sort of competitive world where friendships are made really quickly, and people will find their nemesis, someone who looks just like them, who keeps snatching away parts from them.
I take it you've been in this situation, the same situation as your
Yeah,
heroine.
it's a very strange atmosphere, but it's very fun. It's kind of like the Vegas of the acting world. You go there, you cash your chips, and you have a roll on the table and see what happens. And it's just such an interesting premise because there's all these strangers with the same desires and goals in the same environment, and they really are up against each other. It's kind of a Hunger Games sort of situation. I love the idea of setting a thriller there. As an actress, you're only ever going to a casting where everyone else will look like you. So you're going up for, I don't know, one of the characters in the book is, it's one of these kind of Mars terraforming expedition TV series, where they have to go to Mars and make it habitable. She's head of biochemistry, and she's also a British woman who enjoys horse riding and used to do ballet.
Right.
This kind
A very
of thing.
clear and obvious,
Character. She's called Rose. Everyone who goes to the audition will look like this white British brunette woman. They will have put all of these things down, and that's the only people they'll see for it. And people will dress the same because they're like, oh, what would a British biochemist wear? And so you're in a room full of people who look vaguely similar to you or scarily similar to you. And the idea of setting a thriller in that kind of situation is, to me, very interesting.
All right, so let's talk about the premise more specifically of this novel, The Disappearing Act. Mia Elliott goes to one of these auditions and she meets a young woman named Emily who looks scarily like her.
Everyone in the room does. And the thing with auditions is people are coming and going. You get like a 5-10 minute slot with the casting director. So people are coming and going all day. Emily strikes a friendship with Mia. And just before she's about to go into her audition, she asks Mia to just go and fill up her parking meter for her, which is just downstairs. And because Mia doesn't want to go in before her, which is the alternative, because she hasn't finished looking at her lines, she agrees to do it. And then when she comes back, Emily has completely disappeared and left her with her car keys and her wallet. And then as the novel goes on, Mia is desperately trying to find out what happened to Emily, and she still has her possessions. Also, there's a camaraderie involved in like the acting world. It's a kind of a sportsmanship. So the idea that she would go and pay the meter, I mean, I've done people favors like, could you just go outside and tell my boyfriend that I'm going to be 10 more minutes or whatever, things like that. You just find yourself doing like things like that. But this goes wrong for Mia, and subsequently she gets pulled into this absolutely terrifying adventure.
One of the most interesting things for the reader, at least in my experience for me, is that, of course, when you read a thriller, you're always waiting for the thing to go wrong. But what doesn't go wrong for Mia is professional. Professionally, everything is going right. It's going so well that you think like, wait a minute, she's got to flub at one of these auditions. And yet she doesn't. And in a weird way, it sort of ups the tension. I don't know if that was intentional or if you thought about that.
Yeah, for a lot of actors, there's also an underlying, I think not just actors, but for anyone, sometimes it can be more terrifying if you get what you want. You get that promotion, they're like, oh my God, I actually have to do that job now. So she's sort of trying to balance her life and these things that keep going right, that she's not quite expecting to go right, and all the fallout that comes from them going right, in a world where everyone you're friends with is also trying to do the exact same thing as you. I wanted it to heighten the tension. So she's got much more to lose as the story goes on. And then at the end, it's really a question of whether you think it was worth it or not.
It's very much a women in Hollywood story in that there are elements of sexual misconduct and abuses. There's a kind of lightly veiled reference to Harvey Weinstein. There's more along those lines that I don't want to, no spoilers in this podcast. I'm not going to say anything. And then there's also this intense competition, but also camaraderie, this frenemy thing going on between all of these actresses competing for the same roles. Was that a theme that you deliberately wanted to get at in the book?
Yes, yeah, I did. There's a sliding scale of inappropriateness in the Me Too movement, from, bullying in the workplace or right up to the other end, the sort of Harvey Weinstein end of things. And what I always say about the entertainment industry is that there's no HR department. It's an industry built on dramatics, and it's very easy for there to be spillover between, a scene with a couple arguing and, you only have to listen to sort of those on-set recordings of actors shouting at lighting people or whatever. Tensions run high because that's what you're filming. You might be filming a scene where your car explodes and, it's real fire. If you get burnt, it's real fire. So, you're well within your rights to be quite angry if you get burnt. I thought it was just such an interesting environment to set a thriller because the boundaries between what's real and what's not real are so blurred.
I want to talk about setups, the premise for thrillers, because all three of your books have had really good ones, and we're not going to talk about endings, although I want to talk about the relationship between setup and endings after. But first, give us the premise for your first novel, Something in the Water, and talk a little bit about how you came up with that idea.
So it's about a woman called Erin, who's a documentary filmmaker, and she's just about to get married to the love of her life, Mark, who's an investment banker. But he loses his job just before they get married, and they have a sort of minor problem in the relationship, but they sort it out. They go on holidays, an amazing honeymoon to Bora Bora. And whilst they're on a scuba diving trip off the coast of Bora Bora, they find a bag in the water, something in the water, and what's inside it changes the course of their lives going forward.
All right, we won't go any further than that. I just want to skip ahead to the premise of Mr. Nobody.
The premise for Mr. Nobody was based around a news story that came out in England in the early 2000s about a man who was found on a beach in Kent. Subsequently, he was labelled the Piano Man because nobody knew what his name was, but he could play the piano. All the labels had been cut out of all of his clothes. Nobody knew where he was from. He had no memory of where he was from. He was diagnosed as being in a fugue state.
The kind of thing Hollywood loves.
Yeah, exactly.
A writer's dream, too.
Yeah. But it was set in, in rainy England. And, it was this sort of spark of glamour in like a rainy, at the time, very sad country, and everyone wanted to know who he was. And he seemed like a genius. He could play the piano with no memory of anything else. And the media over here went crazy. They came up with all kinds of stories. There was a hotline to call if you thought you knew him. I think a politician in Hungary said it was her missing husband. Like, it got real traction. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if that happened again? If that happened again in England.
Did they ever find out, like, what was the real ending? Was it sort of sad and disappointing?
It was, of course it was. Of course it was. No, it wasn't. He wasn't any of the things that anyone thought he was. And it turned out he was, suffering from some mental health problems. And my story is slightly different, much more of a psychological thriller aspect to it.
So these ideas, which are all really enticing, man on the beach, nobody knows who he is, has forgotten everything but playing the piano, or a couple discovers this unexpected lute in Bora Bora, or an actress is on an audition and a competitor mysteriously disappears. These all sound like plausibly easy to come up with. Perhaps you could even, as with Mr. Nobody, find them in the news. What is more difficult, I think, for a lot of people is to figure out, well, what is the ending? Like, where is that going to go? Why did these things happen? And so I want to know about your process. Do you know immediately? Do you need to come up with what the ending is first and then figure out how to unveil it layer by layer in the narrative? Or do you not know yourself as you go along?
What I like to do is I have to submit a synopsis for every book to my publisher, but I never give the twist away in the synopsis, partly because it's more exciting, I think, if they don't know as well until they read it the first time, and then you can get a real feel for if it's hit home or not. But also because I usually have 2 or 3 twists in my head of which direction I want it to go in. Now, that is really good because that offers me, as I go through, to keep possible red herrings alive and have completely plausible reasons why it could turn out to be that way. And that way, when I get to the end, I could make a clear decision about which of those I do actually want it to be, and which I think is the most surprising and fulfilling for the reader. And also, it's always nice to have an extra twist, just so as they're finishing the book, they can go, oh my God, and then it's over. It's nice to have a little extra kicker in there as well.
So your 2 most recent books, Mr. Nobody and this new one, The Disappearing Act, have come out back to back. I read them both in the pandemic, which is very fast. Did you work on one and just immediately start working on the other? Or how do you balance all of this? Because you also, I should say, have a young child.
I do, yes. I gave birth 2 days before Mr. Nobody came out last year. I didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, but yeah, it was.
That would have been very clever for you to have known, like that, where that was going.
Yeah, I know. Actually, it was all my fault. I did it, guys. So yeah, my book deal is one book a year. So what I tend to do is I tend to get a first draft in, and by the time I've got a first draft in, I start thinking of ideas for the next one. I'm just trying to treat it like a job, but a very fun job. And it's been great during the pandemic because there's been nothing in production pretty much in terms of acting. So I've had aside from obviously childcare, I've had a pretty clear run for writing my last book. It's a quality problem, definitely. But after the fourth one comes out, I haven't yet secured another book deal. So I might have some rest. I might come up with some more ideas.
Something in the Water was a bestseller, kind of instant success. Do you feel now like an actor who writes or a writer who acts, or how do you conceive of your role right now?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. It's funny, when I'm acting, everyone wants to hear about the writing. And when I'm writing, my publishers want to hear about the acting. So I think at the moment I'm still both. I don't know, when the pandemic lifts properly and things go back into production, we'll see if something takes precedence. But I've also I'm tentatively starting out doing script writing as well. So I don't know if I'm kind of merge both things together in some way.
There's one of your plot twists.
Yeah.
All right. We won't give anything else away about the books themselves and leave it for readers to discover. The new book is called The Disappearing Act. Your previous novels were Something in the Water and Mr. Nobody. Catherine, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review, my colleague Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So my story for you today is about the 50th anniversary of the Association of American University Presses from October the 11th, 1987. And that week, we actually turned over our regular bestseller lists to University Press books. What we did was a little bit unusual. We didn't do the research ourselves. We let presses nominate books and give us numbers, but I'm completely fascinated by it, especially the fiction list. And I have to say, it's a reminder to me how many books that we know the names of and think of and talk about today started out as University Press books.
Give us some examples.
So number one on the fiction list is Long Day's Journey into Night. I guess that's not a surprise. But number two, The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy.
Who published that?
Naval Institute Press.
Wow.
Which I had not remembered, right?
What year was this?
1987.
Okay. Keep going. What else?
All right. Stephen Kuntz, The Flight of the Intruder. Okay, maybe that's not a name you know book-wise, but you should know Stephen Kuntz's name as an author. Also, Naval Institute Press. A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean at number 6.
Who published that?
That was published by Chicago. A Confederacy of Dunces at number 9. That was Louisiana State. There's some older books that also make the list. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Mm-hmm.
Feminist Press at City University of New York published. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, which was published by University of Illinois. I'm just kind of fascinated by this.
What was on the nonfiction side?
Nonfiction side, fewer titles that you would recognize today. I would say the most famous one is Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginnings, which I had completely forgotten, was published by Harvard.
Totally fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway, I've been told, university presses pick up the ball where the major publishers drop it. And I do understand that. And I suppose I agree with it to some extent. But this really illustrated pretty starkly how many books were first published by university presses.
A glimpse from 1987. Tina, thank you.
Sure.
Michael Dobbs joins us now from Bethesda, Maryland. He is a former reporter and foreign correspondent for The Washington Post, the author of several books, including Down with Big Brother, 1 Minute to Midnight, and 6 Months in 1945. His latest book is King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Michael, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
So your previous books, it may be apparent from the title, are about things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fall of the Soviet Union. Obviously, this one is about another big moment of crisis, Watergate. What's the draw for you for these hinge moments in history?
Well, I guess the initial draw was that I was a reporter in Moscow during the period when communism collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated. So I was interested in pivotal or hinge moments in history. And having written that first book, Down with Big Brother, I then became interested in another pivotal moment in the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really is the ultimate hinge moment when the very existence of the planet hung in the balance. It comes from, I guess, being a reporter and focusing on the drama and the opportunity to write a second draft of history rather than the first, which I was focused on as a reporter.
These are all moments that we tend to know quite well, which I imagine is a challenge as a writer. Obviously, you encountered them first as a reporter and then as the author of a book. But these are also subjects that many people have written books about. How do you approach the narratives? How do you make it your own or do something different?
Right. I think there's always something more to be said. And just to talk about the latest book, I mean, of course, there have been dozens of books about Watergate and dozens of biographies of Nixon, but I'd like to think mine is different. It has a different time frame, but the most important difference is that it's told from the inside rather than from the outside. If you think of the big Watergate books, particularly the most famous of them all, probably All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein, that's the story of two reporters pursuing this scandal into the White House and trying to figure out what was going on in the White House. And now, 50 years later, because we have access to these extraordinary materials, particularly Nixon's own tape-recorded conversations, one can tell the story from the inside rather than the outside. And I really think that, we're never again going to get such an intimate look at a president facing an existential crisis as it's possible to get with Richard Nixon.
You describe in the book a conversation you had with the late Watergate historian Stanley Cutler, author of The Wars of Watergate, and that spurred the idea for this book. What was that conversation and what motivated you to write this?
Yeah, well, this was a number of years ago before his death. And the Nixon tapes were just coming out of the National Archives, the chronological release of all the tapes as opposed to just a few of the tapes. And I wanted to talk to Cutler about the release of the tapes. And he surprised me by saying, in 20 years, all the Watergate characters will be forgotten. The only one anyone will remember will be Nixon himself, and he will endure forever.
I want to talk, obviously, about Nixon himself, but there are a couple of elements of this book. You alluded to one that make it different, one being the time frame, the other, the structure as a tragedy. And I want to talk first about that time frame because you really focus on about 100 days. What's the starting point for the narrative, and why did you decide to focus on that very tightly on that period? Because, of course, Watergate, you could argue, began earlier, much earlier than where you begin your story.
Right. I begin the story in January of 1973 on the eve of Nixon's second inaugural. He still has a 67% approval rating. He's had this smashing re-election victory, and he thinks he's largely put Watergate behind him. And over the next 100 days, his presidency unravels and he becomes enmeshed in Watergate himself. There was a famous author, Teddy White, who wrote a series of books called The Making of the President. And I'm really interested in the opposite to Teddy White, not the making of the president, but the unmaking of the president. And I think it's really captured in this particular period.
I want to actually go back to that beginning. He won his re-election in a landslide. That's something that I think is unfathomable to many people today, especially if they weren't alive and politically aware at that time, because he's depicted so decisively in our popular culture and history and the media as the ultimate bad guy. It's hard to imagine what was appealing about him to begin with. And even when we look back on moments during his presidential campaigns, we look at the moments of failure. We look at the tapes of him debating Kennedy and sweating under the lights. How do you explain the appeal of Nixon at that time, the beginning of your narrative?
Well, Nixon suffered some devastating losses, particularly to John F. Kennedy in 1960, obviously. But in 1972, he represented the majority of the country. I mean, he won the largest popular vote margin in American history up until that time. So he represented, really, as he put it himself, the silent majority in America. That is, the people who opposed the anti-war movement, or who were alarmed by the anti-war movement and the counterculture of the 60s. It's rather like, de Gaulle in France. There was this student revolution in 1968, and then de Gaulle rode back to power on the counter-reaction to the student revolution. I think Nixon did very much the same thing in the United States. He identified these divisions in American society, divisions which continue to exist to this day, and he realized that there were a lot of people alarmed by all the events that had been taking place in the 1960s, and that was the basis of his political support.
You make one point about him personally in the book, which is that everything that he gained, every success that he had was on him, as well as every failure was his own fault. Why is that? I mean, he really did come up from very humble origins.
This is the story of a president who made himself and then destroyed himself. And, I think it's Shakespearean in that sense. He was born to, struggling Quaker parents. His father failed as a farmer and then pretty much failed as a grocer. So, Nixon had to struggle for practically everything in his life. And in the process, he developed a burning resentment, even hatred, of the people who had it much easier, including the intellectual elite. And this also formed part of his political basis. Now, his hatred of his enemies, which he frequently expresses in the tapes, they were a plus in that they gave him the motivation to make it all the way to the top. But it was also the fatal flaw that ended up destroying him.
You obviously had to listen to many hours of tapes, as anyone who writes about Nixon has to do. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the way he described his enemies in those tapes. What did he say?
Yeah, well, there are numerous occasions on the tapes when he's railing against the media, the Eastern establishment, the Jews. He was an equal opportunity hater.
Let me say, Henry, it's going to be the worst thing that ever happened to Jews in American history. If they torpedo this summit, which might go down for other reasons, I'm going to put the blame on them, and I'm going to do it publicly at 9 o'clock at night before any million people. Now, that's it, Henry. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, I agree completely. They'll have brought it on themselves. They put the Jewish interest above America's interest. It's about goddamn time that the Jew in America realized he's an American first and a Jew second.
But right at the end of his presidency, the day that he announces his resignation, he gives a talk to the White House staff, and he says this:
"We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then
you destroy yourself." And I think in a way that is the story of Nixon's tragedy encapsulated in that phrase that he used himself. He's probably applying it to other people, but it actually applies to him.
It's interesting when you talk about Nixon as a tragic figure. I think we often think about a tragic figure as someone who could have been a hero, who had the potential for greatness. Do you see Nixon that way?
Well, I think he's a tragic figure because we can see him fall from a great height, and we can experience the suffering and pain that he felt during his fall. Some people say, well, he didn't have any nobility of spirit, and nobility of spirit is an essential ingredient to a tragic character. I'd like to just quote actually a line from the book in which Nixon's talking about his hopes for peace, and he's talking to Ron Ziegler. He says, "The hopes of the whole goddamn world of peace, Ron. You know where they rest? They rest right here, in this goddamn chair. Whatever they think of me," he's talking about journalists, "they got to realize that I'm the only one at the present time in this whole wide blinking world that can do a goddamn thing. You know, keep it from blowing up." I mean, some people might dismiss this as just evidence of Nixon's grandiosity, but it shows the scale of his ambitions and the breadth of his ambitions. I mean, he really thought that, world peace depended on him, and he developed a strategy, perhaps a misbegotten strategy, to remake the world, to ensure peace, as he thought, for another generation.
I want to go back to that earlier moment you described at the beginning of your narrative. Right after the election, he wins in a landslide. He seems to be at the height of his powers. Many people obviously know the history of Watergate like the back of their hand. It's a story that people either obsess about or they don't know anything. And I want to cater to those who don't know anything for just a moment. What happens next?
Well, he thinks he's put Watergate behind him, but the Watergate trial has actually already begun in Washington. And the burglars are giving their account, which is essentially to claim that they carried out the burglary by themselves without any direction from above. The judge, John Schiriker, doesn't believe them. And one of the burglars, James McCord, he doesn't think that he should be made to take the blame for this scandal. And he's particularly disturbed by the perjury of one of Nixon's aides, a man called Jeb Magruder, who denies in open court that he had anything to do with Watergate, when in fact he authorized it. So that triggers McCord's decision to cooperate with investigators. And McCord's decision to cooperate with investigators in turn results in the unraveling of the Watergate conspiracy, with Nixon's aides all turning on each other and eventually turning on the president himself. So that is the framework, really, for my book.
Did your understanding of Nixon change during the course of working on this book, your estimation of him as a person?
Well, I think any biographer of a famous figure is forced to step into the shoes of his main character and see events from his point of view. So I wouldn't say that I became more sympathetic to Nixon, but I certainly became more empathetic in the sense that I experienced his pain, and I also understood some of the actions that he took as he understood them at the time. In that sense, my understanding of Nixon changed. I mean, I guess I began, like many people, with a kind of liberal caricature of Nixon as black and white. And then the more you dig into it, you begin to see him in shades of gray, and you see different aspects to his personality. For example, his relations with his family, which are heartbreaking in this period. He drifts away from members of his family. I have a picture in the book of him and Pat Nixon sort of moving in different directions on the beach at Key Biscayne in Florida. But on the other hand, you also see his loving relationship with his younger daughter, Julie, who's trying her best to help her father. So this human dimension of Nixon's fall, I don't think is captured very well in other Watergate books, but I was certainly interested in exploring it.
Do you think history has judged Nixon accurately and fairly?
I think in terms of Watergate, yes. I mean, obviously he committed crimes. He contributed to obstruction of justice. He, in fact, ordered the cover-up of Watergate, although there's no evidence that he ordered the Watergate break-in itself. But I agree with Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, that he caused Watergate through various abuses that he did condone. I think his reputation has probably increased a little bit as a result of the last 4 years. The comparisons frequently made with Donald Trump, and in my view, Nixon comes off well by that comparison. He's a much more serious, substantive president than Donald Trump, despite the fact that they obviously have some things in common.
I don't think that most liberals look back on Nixon's presidency as something to long for, to admire. But on the other hand, as the Republican Party has drifted further to the right, people have looked back on his presidency and said, well, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded during his presidency. His policies would be considered, many of them, to be liberal today. Do you think that's an accurate assessment of his politics?
Well, in some ways, he was what would now be considered the liberal wing of the Republican Party. But more than that, I think he accepted the rules of the political game in the United States. He didn't publicly object to the result of the very closely run 1960 election, when he had much more reason to complain that Trump did in the last election. The 1960 election was much closer, but Nixon accepted that. And ultimately, the system worked when it forced his resignation in July of 1973. And Nixon certainly wasn't happy about that. But he did recognize the authority of the Supreme Court, and he left office with a modicum of grace, having demonstrated that the system works and that peaceful transition of power is possible and desirable. So I think Nixon, for all his faults and even his crimes, is within the mainstream of American presidents in a way that our last president wasn't.
And one of the legacies of Watergate on a very surface level is that anytime there's any kind of scandal, we automatically add gate to the word. But what do you think of as the most important lasting legacy of Watergate, and what makes it an American tragedy?
Well, you're right that Watergate was the archetypical scandal against which all other political scandals are now measured. Why is that? Because it captured the imagination of Americans at the time. It became a daily soap opera. People tuned in to their TV shows and radio shows every night while the Watergate hearings were going on in Congress. Some of the subplots of Watergate are now very difficult to understand. But as Stanley Cutler said, right at the middle, you have this very compelling figure, Richard Nixon, with whom we're still trying to grapple 50 years later, a man who, changed America and changed the world in ways that we're still coming to terms with. And in many ways, you can draw a line directly from the divisions in America that Nixon exploited in the late 60s and early 70s to all the divisions that we're trying to deal with today. So I think that Nixon, as Stanley Cutler mentioned, is a president who will be in our heads forever, for both good and for bad.
There's a constant conversation that I feel like takes place comparing that era and our current era and the divisions that existed in society and in American politics and the ways in which Nixon and Trump respectively exploited rather than tried to bridge those divides. I'm curious what that comparison looks like to you. Do you think it was worse during Nixon's time and that Nixon, in running on this idea of the silent majority, was more divisive than Trump, or is it more divisive now?
I think it's more divisive now, largely because of this question of accepting results of the election and the transition of power, which is integral to the way the American system and American democracy works. And we can have ideological divisions and political divisions, which were certainly as deep in the late 60s and 70s as they are now. But when you have a large section of the electorate that does not accept the results of an election, you're getting to a completely new level. And that puts me in mind not of the Nixon-Watergate period, but some of the things that I witnessed as a foreign correspondent, particularly in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where an entire social political system was challenged and ultimately disintegrated. I mean, unfortunately, it can happen here. And, this is quite different from all the trials and crises that we went through in the 60s and 70s, as grave as they were then.
Well, it's a story that continues to fascinate us. The book, again, is called King Richard. Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy by Michael Dobbs. Michael, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So far, book sales continue to be incredibly strong in 2021. Again, this is one of the silver linings of the pandemic era for publishers, is that people are buying and reading a ton of books. And the latest figures from NPD BookScan shows that year-to-date volume is up by 20%. So that's pretty impressive. And in the week ending June 19th of this year, print sales were up by 757,000 units. June of last year was also a pretty big sales period for publishers. There were a lot of people who were looking for books about racial inequality, and they saw a huge spike in sales. It was also as some stores were just opening up again. So the fact that publishers have not only maintained kind of their strong position from the pandemic year of 2020, now as we're looking towards hopefully the end of the pandemic, basically stores are open, people are moving around and traveling, book sales are so far keeping pace. So that seems to be a positive sign. And it looks like there will be a number of big news-making books this summer again, as we had last year. Last year we had the Trump bump from books by Mary Trump and John Bolton and others. And it looks like, surprisingly, there'll be another Trump bump this summer, even though, we're now about 6 months into the Biden administration. People are still publishing, and I think probably they're going to be reading a lot of these news-making Trump books. So this summer alone, just coming up recently and into July, there are a few books that I'm pretty sure are going to generate headlines. One is Michael Bender's book, which covers Trump's impeachment and his reelection effort.
And who is Michael Bender?
He is a senior White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So his book is coming out on July 13th. And there's already been, as is often the case with these news-making books, there's been some headlines generated from that. Another big one is coming out on July 20th from Penguin Press. It's called I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year by Carol Lanig and Philip Rucker, who are also reporters. They work at the Washington Post. They're Pulitzer Prize winning reporters. Their first collaboration on a Trump book was a pretty big success. So I think a lot of people are finding that with these follow-up books, they already have all the access and the sources. And I think the expectation is that some sources that, these reporters have cultivated in the Trump administration will be more candid now that, the administration is no longer in the White House. The other book that Trump news junkies are excited about is Michael Wolff's Landslide, which comes out this summer as well. And of course, he had a huge hit, 2 huge hits. Fire and Fury was his first book, and that was a massive bestseller. The Trump administration tried to stop the publication of that book with a cease and desist. Holt responded by releasing it early. That generated more coverage and more headlines. So getting attacked, we've seen, is a good recipe for success. It worked for John Bolton's book as well. So those are just a few. And of course, these are books by reporters that have been covering the administration. There's a whole nother crop of books coming out from people who served in the administration. And that includes Mike Pence, the former vice president, Kellyanne Conway, President Trump's advisor, and also Jared Kushner, the Trump's advisor and son-in-law. So these are a handful that I'm sure we'll be talking about in coming months and years.
Wow. Any indication of how many books publishers are printing, what the sales look like? Are there pre-sales happening on Amazon and other online vendors?
It's hard to say at this point how strong the appetite for Trump books is now that he's no longer in office. The sort of daily spectacle of the administration isn't something people are glued to. And when these previous releases came out, let's say John Bolton or Mary Trump's, they would often be highly ranked on Amazon, weeks out before they were even available because so many people were pre-ordering them. And I'm not necessarily seeing that with this upcoming crop of Trump books. Of course, that can change if there's like a news leak and it's on cable news and suddenly everyone's looking it up and clicking and buying. So we'll see, what happens when the books come out.
All right. It sounds like we have not heard the last about Donald Trump, at least in book form.
I think that's right. I think there'll be a lot more coming out.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are critics Parl Siegel and Jennifer Salai. Hey there.
Hi, Pamela.
Parl, let's start with you. Which book did you review?
I reviewed Wayward by Dana Spiotta, a novelist who I really admire, really enjoy reading, and this book was just a delight. It's the story of this woman at sort of mid-age. She calls it the mid, and she's sort of in the throes of menopause, and it couldn't have arrived at a worse time. Her mother is starting to ail, her daughter is starting to keep secrets, and it's in the days after Donald Trump's election, which her husband thinks she's taking too personally, and she just sort of freaks out and buys herself this huge sort of crumbling house in another part of town. And the book it sort of just explores her mental state, the storm of her body, the sort of shedding, this moving into a new state of life. It made me think a lot about books of initiation and flowering. I mentioned Colette in my review, and books about menopause and about this state in time. And Spiotta writes with so much wit. And I also mentioned in my review that, so much contemporary fiction is about ideas, about contemporary fiction, that when I was reading this, I had that very old-fashioned feeling of just really being seduced and abducted by a novel. The descriptions are so delicious. The characters so well drawn. The story is so simple that you really realize like how artful the construction of this narrative, of this sort of structure is, that just sort of holds you. And so I had a very, very, very good week, even though it's a book about some very difficult things in this one character's life. She is so funny and so frustrated. She kind of reminds me of some of the great narrators of Anita Bruckner's novels and Zoe Heller's novels, these sort of very cranky, cantankerous, all-seeing women who've just had it. And she's great fun to be with.
Okay, I have a couple of very basic questions. Tell us a little bit about Dana Spiotta, her previous books, what her style is like, what she's known for.
So Dana Spiotta is perhaps best known for her books, including Stone Arabia and Lightning Fields. The shorthand when you're talking about Spiotta is she's a writer who's very good at talking about identity, multiple identities, people in hiding from themselves, fugitives, hoaxes, in short, great American characters, and she's very much seen and admired as a writer who's very good at talking about the noise of any particular moment. The consumerism of the 80s, for example, right now in this book, she's very good at a certain kind of internet discourse that's happening. So she's very sharp, she's very attuned to the language of the moment, to how people see and don't see each other, and to modes of communication. That is a very, very big thing in her, in all of her fiction, how people are trying to reach out, looking for a response, literally looking for a response. They're on the telephone, they're sending texts, they're not being heard. But I think underneath all of this is a very rigorous, and to me, it feels like very old-fashioned moral kind of novelist. She's really looking at, when we choose, we're choosing for other people. And when other people choose, they're choosing for us. We're enmeshed together. And what does this mean? And the classic way that novelists have explored this is, by writing about families, people that we live with that we don't necessarily always choose. And how do we make a go of it? These are serious questions, but she's also incredibly funny and pointed. And so it never feels didactic, I think, which makes it all go down a little bit better.
Second, very basic question. What is the story in this novel? What's it about? Where does it take place?
It takes place in Syracuse, and the story is sort of, we're in the mind of this woman, and in terms of plot, she eats a piece of cake. She texts her mom. She texts her daughter. Nobody really responds. She kind of polishes the mantle. She's not. There's not plot in the old way that we think of plot. It's very much linked to her consciousness and sort of linked to her very uncharitable thoughts about other women in the same change of life as she is. So it really does ride on voice. And as the book proceeds, it's interesting. There are two strands. One is kind of happening in the present, but the other one sort of takes us in the past. And so we're starting to see little bits of how we got here. It's very tender. It's sort of one of the things that's sort of sometimes hard to talk about in the review is how much a book just made you feel and how it just helped you appreciate. I don't know. I don't want to get too like moist and gooey about this stuff, but it really it's a deeply affecting novel. I think especially if you have children, she really sort of talks about the quickness of it all, the fleetingness of it all, and the sweetness and the joys of it. She's very, very good about it. So
I know how you feel about things moist, so we will quickly move along from there. I guess, Jen, the analogy here, or the similarity here, if we can link it in any way, is Parl said that book is about how we got here and where we are now. And the book you reviewed in a very different way is maybe connected in that respect.
Yes, I was going to say that it's probably the opposite of moist in the sense that it's really quite dry. It's called Nightmare Scenario.
Well, there's a ringing endorsement, Jen.
So it's called Nightmare Scenario Inside the Trump Administration's Response to the Pandemic That Changed History. And it's by Yasmin Abu Talib and Damian Paletta, who both work at the Washington Post. She reports on health policy, and he's the economics editor. And, when I say that it's dry, I should also emphasize that the reason for being for this book, as they state very explicitly, is that they want this to be the first complete narrative account of the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And so in that sense, they're not so much interested in voice, I should say. I think they really do their work diligently and thoroughly. I mean, they talked to maybe 180 people for this book, in preparation for this book. And bear in mind, and they say this very explicitly in the beginning, that they realized at a certain point, because of the number of conflicting stories they got, that there were some people who weren't telling the truth. And so they try to sort through everything and corroborate everything and present this chronological account of essentially what happened between January 2020 and January 2021. And, it's pretty damning. I think for a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily change their understanding as a whole of what happened. It is the kind of book, as would be expected from two people who work at the Post, that there are scoops in it. I mean, there's news in it, but I think it also raises the question, I think, that in the context of the Trump administration, which generated a ton of news during 4 years, what we consider news at this point. I mean, there's a lot of backbiting, infighting, tales of people, especially Trump, saying outrageous things, floating ideas that just are completely bizarre. There's just been so much that's happened in the past year. I had to be reminded that there was that cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, where there were a number of Americans on it early in the pandemic who were infected with COVID. And Trump at some point in a meeting floated the idea of sending them to Guantanamo Bay to be quarantined. So, there's stuff like that in it. And so I think for people who are looking maybe either to relive the past year, I'm not sure who those people might be, or people who want to see what happened when, there is a lot of material in this book. It doesn't really have, though, the striking narrative verve that some other books about the pandemic that have come out recently have, for example, Michael Lewis's book or Lawrence Wright's book. But then again, I think that these authors are trying to do something different.
All right. Well, I won't ask you to linger too much on this book because I know it was not one of your favorites, but let's talk briefly about someone whose work I know you do admire, and that is Janet Malcolm, who died last week. And Jen, you wrote an appreciation, and Parl, I think you're a fan of her work as well. For people who are not familiar with Janet Malcolm, tell us a little bit about her and what made her so distinctive.
So Malcolm was a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker and was known for her essays, for her profiles. A number of the long pieces that she wrote for The New Yorker were turned into actually fairly slender books. The Journalist and the Murderer is perhaps one of the most famous ones, that begins with a line about journalists. And I feel like if I try to paraphrase it now, I'm going to mangle it. But essentially, when she died last week, that was a line that I think everybody took as emblematic of her work. And in a way, I think it's almost deceptive in its own way, the way that it's been reduced to who she was and what she did. What I always found interesting about her is that there was always two things going on in her work, and she was always interested in the way that things are presented or the way that things initially seem, and also the more complicated stuff that was going on underneath. And she would bring that to the fore, I think, when she wrote about the relationships between people. She had The Silent Woman about Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath. I mean, The Journalist and the Murderer is, again, one of the most famous ones. I mean, she was always interested in, I think, that relationship, because it's really in that relationship that you see the discrepancy between how people present themselves and the other things that are going on. So when she died, it was an opportunity to sort of think back to her work and see what it was that really moved me. Because again, the way that so many things always get caricatured in the public imagination. And I felt like some of the responses that I saw when she died didn't necessarily capture the things that I found most interesting to me. But I think that was also the interesting thing about her work, which was, even though the books were actually fairly short, she had collections of essays, but there was just always something going on and there was always something new to discover, I think, the more that you read her. So it was a chance to reflect on that.
Jen, I loved your appraisal, and I have to ask, what's your favorite Janet Malcolm book?
I really love the collection 41 False Starts, which is the one that includes a number of profiles, especially of artists, although it also, I think that's the one that includes a review of the Gossip Girl novels that she also wrote about. I feel like that collection really captured her range and also how sometimes funny she could be, which I felt like was something that doesn't necessarily get talked about a lot. I mean, she's often pointed to, I think rightly, for, very sort of precise, often scathing portraits, but she was very witty. She could see the inherent comedy in certain situations. And that was a book that I felt like captured so much. At the same time, I will say The Journalist and the Murderer, I just find completely absorbing and fascinating and strange every time I read it. How about you, Parl? Do you have a favorite?
I do. I love, you're so right that she's so good on relationships. And I love her book. It's Two Lives, about Gertrude Stein and Alice B.
Oh, yes.
It's just one of the best portraits of a marriage, about the way power flows back and forth. She's so good at talking about Gertrude Stein's the power of the baby, the power of somebody who always believes she's going to be taken care of. These little things that she observes, I don't even really, I can't tweeze them out of my brain. They're just so part of the way I understand the world now, right? The way that we talk about journalism, she's just there. The way that we talk about the problem of biography, there's Malcolm. We're talking about photography, there she is. In that way, she has that kind of Sontagian thing. She's just in the foundations of so much of our, or at least my thinking. I can't imagine what I was like bumbling around before. Psychoanalysis, all of these things. She's so good. Even like the small things she does is watching people, gestures. The silent woman is exhilarating because of that, right? People are always talking to her, but their bodies are always talking too, and she's one of the best people at watching how people give themselves away, I think, just pitilessly. But beautiful, beautiful appraisal.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you both. And I would love for you to run down the titles again, as well as the titles of the books that you would recommend people read by Janet Malcolm.
I reviewed Wayward by Dana Spiotta. And I think if you're new to Malcolm, I'd start with The Silent Woman if you want a full book. And then if you're looking for shorter profiles, 41 False Starts is a great way in, I think.
And I reviewed Nightmare Scenario: Inside the Trump Administration's Response to the Pandemic That Changed History by Yasmin Abutaleb and Damian Paletta. And for a book of Janet Malcolm's, one of my favorites is the one that Parl mentioned, which is the collection of essays, 41 False Starts. I think that her early book, Psychoanalysis, The Impossible Profession, is also way into her approach, which is completely fascinating.
All right. Well, we have lots to recommend our listeners. Jen, Parl, great talking to you both, as always.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.